The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD came out within the last week, and I wanted to make a video talking about it. I wanted to see if it's a good remaster, you know, if they made some good quality of life improvements, and I wanted to see if the game was worth its price tag. So, without further ado, let's get... So it's gonna be that type of video, huh? Well, I wasn't planning on making this video. I wasn't planning on doing this type of format ever on this channel. I don't like making rant videos because I get way too upset. But I made a tweet yesterday that blew up. And so I thought, you know what? This needs to be said. This needs to be put on the channel because it is just absolutely ridiculous. What am I talking about? So I see a lot of game quote-unquote journalists claiming that Skyward Sword HD is a reminder of how bad the Zelda franchise was and how Breath of the Wild saved it, and you know how it needed Breath of the Wild to move on from its old barbaric or archaic period and so on. To that I say, shut up. See, I understand that these articles are for clickbait or rage bait because these sites only exist off of click or rage bait, but I see a lot of people parroting this mentality or this mindset, and to me it's just so disappointing to see every single Zelda game, let alone Skyward Sword, be compared to Oblivion to Breath of the Wild, and more often than not told of how bad of a game it is or how it hasn't aged well because of Breath of the Wild. See, here's the thing, is you're comparing Breath of the Wild, which is a very different game, to other games that are very different in their own regards in the Zelda franchise. The Zelda franchise is not defined by a singular formula. I've had many people argue with me on this, saying, oh, well, that's not right. The Zelda formula is dungeons and Master Sword and this and that. And to that I say, no, you are wrong. It's not even defined by Zelda, the Master Sword, by the dungeon systems, by the items. That's not what defines Zelda. What defines Zelda is the ability to explore a world in a different way each time. Every new Zelda game does this with each release. Let's take a look back at the early days of the franchise. You had what the game was about. You go to dungeons, you fight monsters, you get the boss, you fight the boss, get the piece of the Triforce, save Zelda, boom. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. You had the top-down view of the game, and it was pretty simple. Not too long after, the sequel came out, and already it was vastly different from the first game. It was a side-scroller, it had a magic level system. The combat was very different and a lot more intricate than the first game. And then look at A Link to the Past, where it was very similar. Again, it made huge changes to the franchise that the first and second game did not do. It added new items that allowed you to run across the room faster. It allowed you to hook shot to different places. You could travel to a different world. Same thing with Ocarina of Time. Not only was Ocarina of Time 3D, but it added a new music travel system that wasn't necessarily integrated at all in the previous games. You were now able to go back and forth in time and interact with the world in different ways as time changed. Majora's Mask also completely changed the formula of Zelda. Instead of having all the linear dungeons and doing this and this and that, you weren't in Hyrule anymore. You were in Termina, a completely different world. You had 3 days to beat the game, otherwise the world would end. There was a larger emphasis on music and the impacts of music. Majora's Mask was very much a literary piece of Zelda. It was very much a reference to things like Dante's Divine Comedy and other literary pieces from the past. Majora's Mask was a very meta game, and that was not done in the franchise before. Next, we get Wind Waker. Same deal with Wind Waker. Wind Waker for the first time allowed you to travel over the seas. It allowed you to fly in the air with the Deku Leaf. It allowed so many different things to happen. It added a new art style. It added, for the first time in a Zelda game, a free camera. You can now move the camera around Link and look in different places, whereas before you had to Z-target and look to see your position. This greatly changed the Zelda franchise because every game after this, you would be allowed to do this free roam camera. Twilight Princess, same deal. Not only did Twilight Princess become arguably the darkest game in the Zelda franchise, both for its graphics and tonality, but it also added a brand new mechanic of transforming into a wolf. You know, now not only were you a wolf where you could attack and beat bosses and enemies as a different animal entirely, but now you could travel to the world of Twilight as a wolf. You were restricted to that as a wolf for a while. You know, you would go back to different areas. So many different mechanics were added into Twilight Princess as well. Horse combat was also added in Twilight Princess. Now, you can fight enemies on horseback and race and all these other things that weren't present in previous Zelda games. When Skyward Sword first came out, the same deal happened with that as well. First time ever, you could go in the sky flying on a giant bird. You could travel between sky and land and have different worlds basically in between sky and land. You had the new motion controls, which were very different from Twilight Princess's motion controls. They were very much integrated into the game on a deeper level. And then, of course, Breath of the Wild changed the franchise by adding a new weapon system. And it added a connected world that wasn't necessarily accessible in previous titles like it would be in this one. I have just proven to you that every single entry in the Zelda franchise greatly changes upon the last one. There is no definitive formula of how the dungeons should be structured, of how the overworld is laid out. Nothing is ever the same with each game. Even with games like Twilight Princess, which is regarded as a carbon copy of Ocarina of Time, still does things very differently than Ocarina of Time did. So why is it that people are saying that Breath of the Wild changed the Zelda franchise in a way that no Zelda game has done before? Well, that's obvious because it did through its weapon system and its open world, but that doesn't mean that other Zelda games before it did not change the franchise for the better. The franchise improves upon itself with each title. Although many people don't like Skyward Sword, you can see so many elements of that game that were implemented into Breath of the Wild. At E3, they even talked about how a lot of elements from Skyward Sword were implemented. And you can see, you got the goddess Hylia. You get her statues everywhere in Breath of the Wild. You get the sailcloth, which was then turned into the paraglider. You got the energy wheel that was reintegrated. Parrying with the shield was added from Skyward Sword. Durability in items was added from Skyward Sword. Skyward Sword had a big impact on Breath of the Wild, and you can tell that the creators love Skyward Sword, and that they thought that a lot of ideas that were in Skyward Sword would translate well into Breath of the Wild, and they absolutely did. I am just sick of seeing these articles basically stomp into the ground every Zelda game, you know, not just Skyward Sword, but any Zelda game that isn't Breath of the Wild simply because it's not Breath of the Wild. I understand that Breath of the Wild was a lot of people's first Zelda game, and that's not a bad thing by any means. And if you don't like any of the other Zelda games and you only like Breath of the Wild, that's perfectly fine too. But my point is that all these articles, all these media places are saying that Zelda was never really that good until Breath of the Wild came along. And that just inherently is not true. And I am sick and tired of seeing these outlets push that narrative. It's not right. It's degrading to the community, and it also splits the community apart. This is the type of stuff that I would see from the Star Wars fan base. This is the type of stuff that you would see from those type of people. I know, I used to be in that. I used to be in that circle. This is the type of stuff that we would do, where we'd say, oh, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. Then what do you enjoy? Oh, I don't know. If you like one Zelda game, then yes, you are a Zelda fan, as long as you like one game. But if you hate every single game, then you're not. You're not. And that's okay. You don't have to be a fan. Just because something's popular, you don't have to be a fan of it. You don't have to try to be a fan of something you're not. Likewise, it's also not our job to tell people that they can't be a fan. That, well, you have to like all these Zelda games, or you can't like this Zelda game in order to be a fan. No, if somebody wants to like Breath of the Wild, let them. If someone wants to dislike Skyward Sword, let them. If somebody wants to say that Four Swords on the Game Boy is the best Zelda game ever, then okay. If someone wants to tell me that the CDI Zelda games are actually pretty good and they deserve a remake, sure, go ahead. That's fine with me. That's not the point. The point is that these outlets are spurring a narrative that is so detrimental to the Zelda community. You know, not only is it basically saying Zelda is just garbage except Breath of the Wild, but it's basically just shitting on all of us who have loved other Zelda games, and it's invalidating us for liking those games. And we know how Nintendo responds to stupid critics of how, oh, well, you didn't like this, so we're just not going to do remakes anymore. Oh, we're just not going to do this for Zelda anymore. Because Nintendo has those knee-jerk reactions for whatever reason. So it's our responsibility to hold these media outlets accountable for not spewing this fucking bullshit. I got way too mad in this video, guys. You know, and it's not even about Skyward Sword itself. It's about Zelda as a whole, of how Breath of the Wild is not the bastion for the series. It is not the game that is the standard for all of Zelda, nor should it be held as such. Breath of the Wild is a very flawed game, and I could get into that of why it is a flawed game, but that's not what I'm here for. I'm here to remind you, and just remind myself, that Zelda is about how different each game is. And if you don't like Skyward Sword, if you don't like Breath of the Wild, that's perfectly okay. And if you like both, that is also perfectly okay. My problem comes from anybody that says you cannot have an opinion, or says that every Zelda game besides Breath of the Wild is trash because it's not Breath of the Wild. So guys, thank you so much for coming to this rant. I know it was long-winded. I know I got very upset. But yeah, I have a video coming out this next week that was way behind. But I had to get this out, guys. Don't be that person that tells somebody that their opinion is invalid for liking or disliking something about Zelda. Do not tell them that their series is garbage simply because all the other games is not the same as one game. It's not right, and it's really just detrimental to the community. Thanks guys for coming, and I'll catch you later.